Hey there, do you want to play a game where you can summon angels, demons, dragons, brave soldiers, even attractive rat ninjas? Well, I got the game for you, Magic the Gathering. Now in this guide, I'm going to be showing you how to play Magic, the basics. Not going to get into any crazy details, but enough for you to at least get started. Okay, so first we're going to talk about cards before we talk about how to play them. So the very first cards we're going to talk about is your lands. Lands are going to be your bread and butter for playing the game. You'll use them for mana to basically play every single other card. You'll get basically several different kinds of lands, but the majority of land cards are going to be your just basic cards. And you're going to notice that they come in a variety of different colors. I'll get into that later in the video. Next, I'm going to talk about a card that's a little bit more difficult to explain, but I'll try my best. And that is tokens. Tokens are cards that are not represented by a mana cost, like all the other cards that you will be playing. They will usually be placed on the board, and they either will be creatures or special items that you can use to boost your other spells. And you usually play them by using the effects of other cards. Then the next kind of card I want to talk about is sorceries. Sorceries will basically be your spell cards. You'll play them usually on your turn and only on your turn, and they will basically do what the card says. Then after sorceries, we got what's known as instances. Instances can be played at any point of the game. And then finally, we have creature cards. Creature cards can only be played on your turn, and they have something different from the rest of the cards. They have something known as a toughness and a power. The toughness is basically the life points of the creature, and the power or strength number is how strong the creature is. And you can buff both power and toughness using various different spells and effects and all that in the game. Okay, so before I explain how we play the game, there is a special rule that my buddy Zach has always said about Magic, and it is pretty much true. For every rule, there's a card in Magic that breaks said rule. Alright, so next up is the phases of a turn. There are at least 5 phases during your turn. Your upkeep, first main phase, combat, second main phase, and then end step. During your start phase or upkeep, this is the part where you would draw from your deck and untap all your previously tapped cards. A brief explanation of what tapping is. Tapping is when you rotate your cards to essentially play them. You do this to play your lands for mana, or if your creatures have a special tap ability, you would tap them, or when you're attacking with your creatures in your combat phase, this is how you and your opponent tell you played that card. And then after your upkeep phase, you go to your first main phase. This is where you would play any sorcery spells or summoning any creatures or enchantments or placing down artifacts onto the battlefield. Special side note, when you summon a creature, it cannot attack the same turn because it will have what's known as summoning sickness. Of course, unless the creature card has the keyword haste, and then in that case, it will not have summoning sickness and can attack the same turn. And then after your first main phase, you would go into your combat phase. And the combat phase actually has its own phases in it, beginning with beginning of combat, where if there are any cards on the battlefield that have special effects that say at the beginning of your combat phase, those abilities will take effect. And then after the beginning of combat phase, you go to the actual combat phase where you declare your attackers. And this is when you would tap your creature cards that you want to attack during that turn. Then after declaring attackers, your opponent will go into declare blockers phase. And at this point, this is when the strength and toughness portions of creature cards come into play. See, When your opponent declares his or her blockers against your attackers, they would pick which blocker is blocking which attacker. And at this point, basically, each creature would basically be punching each other at the same time. This is where you compare the strength stat to the blocking toughness stat. And basically what happens is if the strength is a higher number than the toughness, the blocking creature dies. But if the strength stat is lower than the blocker, then the blocker survives. And it's the same thing with the blocker attacking the attacker. If the blocker's strength is higher than the attacker's toughness, the attacker is dead. This is a very important thing to keep track of when declaring your blockers and your attackers, because you can very easily lose all your attackers or all your blockers if you're not careful during this step. Then of course, after the blockers are declared, and if there are any attackers that are able to get through the blockers, they would basically hit and do damage to the target opponent, and the opponent would lose life depending on how much damage the attacker got through. And so at this point, we would go into the second main phase, and at this point, any untapped land you use as mana if you want to play any other spells before you end your turn, and which is usually pretty quick. Most people just straight up forget about this part, but you can play spells after the combat phase. And then after that is your end step. End step basically is when any of your creatures that took a damage this turn heal up back to full health before your opponent's turn, and any sort of end phase abilities or actions are triggered, and then your turn is done and it goes to your opponent. Okay, so we're going to get into some keywords that you should keep track of as a new player, because many of these will be on cards but won't have definitions to them. Obviously, we went over what tapping and what haste is, so we're just going to skip over those two. We're going to go to first strike. First strike is basically, instead of the creatures hitting each other at the same time, whatever creature has first strike on it will be able to hit first before the other creature. If a creature has double strike, it means basically it gets to hit twice. So there'll be the first initial hit, and then it'll make a second one if it survives the first combat strike from the other creature. Then there's vigilance. Vigilance is usually when for creatures that can attack and block at the same turn. Basically, once a creature is tapped, it can't block unless it has vigilance. Then it can tap to attack and still block the same turn. And then the last keyword you should probably really remember is permanents. Permanents are basically the cards that stay on the battlefield for the whole game, like your lands, your creatures, your enchantments, your auras, stuff like that. There will be mini cards that would say destroy target permanent or something like that. So just remember, permanents means cards that just stay on the field through the whole game unless something happens to said card. Okay, so we're going to get into basic deck building before we get into the colors, because I feel like you're going to need to understand a little bit about deck building before you get into colors. So first things first, you need to figure out what format of Magic you are playing. Are you going to be playing Modern? Are you going to be playing Legacy? Are you going to be playing Commander? Majority of formats are going to use 60 card decks, with the exception of Commander. Commander uses a 100 card deck system, but that's his own beast entirely and deserves its own video about how to build a Commander deck. So don't worry about building a 100 card Commander deck, because that's its own beast. We're going to stick to most formats which use a 60 card deck system. Now, this is going to be true with every format. You're going to want at least 1/3 of your deck to be lands. Now, you can have as many basic lands as you want in your deck, but with every other card that has a name, you're going to have a maximum of 4 of each. This is for balance reasons. So even if it's a land, if it's a special land with a name, you can only have 4 of said land, or creature, or spell. Now, They can have similar abilities, but you can't exceed more than 4 if it has the same name. Now, this is going to be important when I talk about colors later. So, now you want to decide what game style do you want your deck to be like, and that's where colors come in. Each color has its own game style to it, and I'll explain what they are and what, starting with best ones to start off with for beginner players, working my way to most difficult. First, we're going to start with white. White is your plain Jane color. You're going to have regular human soldiers. You're going to have some angels. You're going to have some flying, some vigilance. You're going to have some buffs, but nothing too crazy and too hard to understand for a new player of the game. Next is green. Green basically does everything that white does, except does more, like producing lots of mana to summon really large creatures, and a lot of really large creatures that also have the keyword reach, which can block flying creatures, so on and so forth. They can also make their creatures start out small but get really big and scary. Honestly, green is another really strong choice for a beginning player as well, since it does a lot of things that white can do, sometimes better, but that's a different discussion for a different time. Then we got red. Red is for when you want to be super aggressive and super fast. You're going to have a lot of cheap cards coming out at blazing hot speeds, getting a lot of damage off real quick, because your goal is to basically end the game within a few turns. Otherwise, you're going to run out of steam real fast. So, kind of that middle ground for beginner players if you like that fast gameplay. But just remember, if you can't beat your opponent fast or quick enough, then you're going to struggle in the late game. Then we got my personal favorite, black. Now, black I would not recommend to any beginner players because there's a lot of nuances to black, simply because you're going to have a lot of high risk, high reward type of gameplay, because you're going to be sacrificing your own life points, you're going to be sacrificing your own creatures and other things like that to do damage or give yourself buffs, stuff like that. So there's always a drawback to playing black, but most of the time if you can play it well, the drawbacks become benefits, because you're going to be benefiting yourself in the long run as long as you can survive those first few negatives at the beginning of the game. Now, the last one, blue, I'm going to do my best to stay family friendly when talking about blue, but blue is its own beast. Now, blue is a special case where no one should be touching blue unless you're going multicolor with your deck. And here are my reasons why. Now, some might call this controversial, but blue is a breeding ground for terrible players. Now, I know I'm going to have to explain myself here, because I know someone's going to be out there going, but blue isn't for intelligent players. You have to be big brain to make, blue work. First of all, no, that is a lie. The only reason blue is associated with intelligence is because you've been lied to. You're not a smart little baby boy like your mama said because you play blue control. Now, what is control for those who are new to Magic? Control is a type of game style where you basically tell your opponent no. You are playing cards that are either dispelling their spells, you're stopping them from summoning their creatures, you're stopping any sort of battle damage when they are attacking with their creatures, even if they are lucky to get creatures onto the battlefield, things of that nature. Basically, your opponent cannot play the game while you just sit there, and this creates a breeding ground for bad players, because again, you're not learning how to properly play the game because you're telling your opponent that they can't play. How are you supposed to get good at the game if the person you're playing isn't playing? Does that make sense? Alright, so that basically wraps up this basic guide. I plan on doing more in-depth guides in the future, along with covering other topics that interest me. I hope to do a lot more stuff in the future, and I hope you guys are going to be there to join me. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, or like and subscribe if you didn't like it anyway. Either one is good with me. I hope to see you guys in the near future. Bye.